Well, good morning.
Morning.
It's unusual to be doing an interview in the morning for me. It's usually
Oh, okay.
those late nights, outside of a bar somewhere, as
In a
you
car park.
with rats singing James Brown that we couldn't remember.
Oh my God, yes, I remember that one. That was in Manchester, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the finest moment, if I remember rightly.
I feel good, and I knew that I would now.
Are you getting all this? Are you getting the hips?
Are you getting the hips going now? It was probably one of my favorite interview moments.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he has that effect on people sometimes.
Exactly. You get the right amount of cider in, James Brown going, and none of us remembering the name.
Yeah.
That's the part that got me. We all knew it. We just couldn't remember. Anyway,
I know. It comes to the best of us.
exactly. Exactly. So you have written what I'm calling an encyclopedia. This is a rather large book, but
Yeah, it turned out bigger than I thought it was going to actually. But I'm really pleased with it. I like a chunky book.
so do I. And yesterday I was having my car service, and as you can see, I've been working my way through it. And I'm sitting in the waiting area and I'm reading it. And I'm like, boy, this is a clunky book to carry around with me. This is an at-home reference book. But I still was enjoying it and getting all the great stories that you've gotten here. And how did you get the idea to do this for the post-millennial bands that have been around?
Um, Actually, before I tell you that, I'll just tell you about an email I had of someone who was complaining about the size of the book, and they said they literally cannot read it in bed. So they do all their reading lay in bed, I suppose, one-handed like that.
Yeah.
And they said it's impossible to read in bed. So there's a fact for you on this Sunday morning. I don't know. I mean, so I did the first 4 books on the UK punk scene
Mm.
and sort of brought it up to the millennium. Basically, I did that 90s book,
Mhm.
yeah, from Knuckle Dust on the front cover, and then I went off and did the thrash metal, the UK thrash metal one.
Mm.
But a few people said to me, "Oh, when you going to do a book on what's happened since the millennium?" And I don't know. I didn't really start to think about it until enough time had passed from the millennium so I could look back and think, oh yeah, there's been all these great bands in the last 10, 15 years or whatever.
Yeah.
So I suppose to start with, I was just a bit too close to the time period I was writing about.
Yeah.
But bit by bit, the more I thought about it, the more I thought it needed to be done. If only to show that there's still a vibrant punk scene in the UK, and not all the bands in the book are still together, obviously, but the last 20 years has been fantastic, and it isn't all about the 80s, 70s and the 80s, as much as I love the 80s with a passion, because that was when I got into punk and I was a teenager, and that'll always be the period that resonates most for me because it was my entry point.
Yeah.
But there's just so many fantastic bands, and I can't remember exactly where I was. I'd have been at a gig somewhere, and someone like Grand Collapse or Pizza Tramp or An Evil Hour or someone like that would have been playing. I suddenly thought it's time to do this book.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's those intense, vibrant bands that have the passion that we remember as kids from the early days of punk,
Yeah.
that they still have it.
Mm.
And so I can see why that totally would be like the kick in the rear to say, let's get this out on paper. Let's document the very heavily documented.
Well, I try to articulate it in the intro as well, but I think it's important, for the older punks to remember what they felt like when they first got into punk, and they first went to their local gig and saw their local band, and just remember that there's kids entering the scene, as we speak.
Yeah.
And for them, they don't care about the 70s and 80s bands. You know, the bands that mean something to them, you know, the local bands, the current bands, you know, that are inspiring them now. So I kind of just wanted to show that, you know, there is no end point and start point for punk. It's just an ongoing thing, you know.
Yeah, and it is. And you got to remember the people who were into the Sex Pistols and Sham 69 and all of that, when you and I really started getting into it with things like the Dead Kennedys and Black Flag, they looked at it the same way. They're like, oh, who are these new interlopers and why are they, you know, and they're changing the sound and they're changing the way that we do punk. And
Yeah.
they didn't like it.
No, and you know, I can also remember when I got into punk in the early 80s, I looked at some of the, you know, the original punks from the mid 70s, and you know, almost thought that they were like you know, like a cartoon or a parody. And I think those punks looked at the Teddy Boys, you know, in the same way. So I guess, you know, I think, you know, that's what some of these young kids who are getting into punk now, they might look at, I don't know, you know, all the people that troop up to Rebellion or something and think, you know, that's not punk, you know, this is punk, you know, this, what's happening for them, you know, this really intense creative sort of scene. So yeah, I'm not saying any of it's right or wrong. And to be fair, you know, as you get older and you sort of get off your high horse a little bit, and you know, I can listen to bands from 76 and bands from 2020, you know, from all, and plus, you know, all the other stuff I listen to, you know, the thrash metal and doom metal and psychobilly and everything, you know. So yeah, I'm kind of chilled about all that now. But yeah, this book was very much, I just tried to focus in on the punk bands, and one of the big problems for this book was just how many bands there was going to be, because it was the first time I'd done like a double decade, so 20 years instead of 10, and it was just too many bands. And in fact, as I finished this book, I drafted a list of another 111 bands that could potentially go in a second volume if I was stupid enough to attempt it.
I won't believe what you said when you said this is the last one then.
Well, it might be the last overview book, but it won't be the last book I do on UK punk.
Yeah.
So I've got a few things I'm sort of working on and stuff like that, and they're very much related to punk. And one of the books in particular is, you know, it's going to be really exciting for people into UK punk, but it isn't an overview book, if you know what I mean.
Can you give us any details on that?
I've almost gone into too much detail because I kind of sworn to secrecy on that one.
Fair enough.
I'll as soon as we've ironed out a few of the little bits going on in the background that I just want to get straightened out, I'll announce it straight away, you know.
Yeah, understood on that. Going back to the generational differences, there are a lot of punks who went through the first wave who are now kind of screaming, well, I've seen the words, you know, they don't respect their elders, about a lot of the young bands and the fans of the young bands. And I suppose they're upset that the younger people don't worship at the altar of the older bands, and they're into, like you say, you know, the Grand Collapse and Evil Hour and stuff that they're seeing, their local bands, their friends, you know. What do you think about that? And is there a way we can combat that to change attitudes?
I think it's I kind of think it's healthy, you know, not to have that sort of respect for your elders and put them up on a pedestal. And I know that was one of the things that appealed to me about punk when I got into it, was, you know, that, you know, there were no legends or heroes or anything like that. I mean, I think, I suppose, you know, from my own point of view, I always wanted to explore the roots of the music as well.
Mhm.
And you know, perhaps that's what some of the older punks are saying. It's like, you know, don't forget your roots kind of thing, you know, that sort of, but any time that you sort of patronize or tick someone off like that, you know, saying I know more than you and kids these days, you know, and stuff
Yeah.
like that, you kind of, you know, you're playing into that whole thing, you know. I remember when I was a teenager and I hated the music my parents listened to just because it was the music my parents listened to.
Yes.
Now I realize actually they listen to some really cool music.
Exactly.
but you
Exactly.
know, I was so tied up in Crass and Discharge and stuff like that. And of course that kind of stuff is such you know, it's so confrontational and you know, it's so different to anything else as well. You know, it was a bit like a tidal wave sweeping everything before it, really.
Yes.
But I think, I mean, there's two ways around it. I mean, either the old bands can start to play something really intense that appeals to the new kids, or you know, as the new kids go on and they, you know, they'll start to wonder. You know, I can imagine someone getting into Grand Collapse could then think, oh, okay, so they'll read interviews with Grand Collapse and then they'll check out Icons of Filth, you know, Calv's dad's band,
Yeah.
and then they'll check out Crass, and you know, and that's just the way, you know, like I said, it's an entry point for them. But you know, certainly I don't think anyone can, you know, in fact I love it when some of these young snotty punk bands, you know, say I don't give a fuck about GBH or whatever, you know. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love GBH, but you know, I don't think anyone should be, you know, on a pedestal really in the punk scene.
Yeah, I agree. And that's what it was all about, is no pedestals. Everybody's equal.
Yeah.
And it didn't work out that way. I mean, pedestals were built, people were put on them, but
Yeah,
a lot of the ethos is still there. And I hope
yeah,
that we can kind of level things out, because I don't like seeing a lot of the generational divide. I mean, when I first started going to gigs in Manchester, 7 years ago, something like that, I noticed immediately there were two distinct scenes. There was the scene with the older punks and all the typical older bands. And then there was this new scene with all the young, interesting bands. And I just easily floated between the two because of my history. But I noticed that there were very few people that were at both gigs. I was one of the few people that would go to one of those gigs and one of those gigs, and
yeah.
twice. And I think it's almost becoming a self-perpetuating problem.
Yeah, and it's a bit frustrating because the punk scene's not that big and no band wants to play to a half full or quarter full
Yeah.
or less room. So I mean, it'd be great if, you know, if people can get their schedules, you know, so gigs don't clash.
Yeah.
You know, it could just be one big scene, but you know, that's just wishful thinking, really. Yeah. I think it's always, you know, it's always been like that. You know, I remember hardcore in the 90s, you know, when Stamping Ground were touring, and you know, we'd play a gig and people would say, oh, none of the old school guys have come because it's a new school bill. And I'm thinking it's just a hardcore gig, you know. And I suppose I think the same way now, you know, it's just a punk gig. Why isn't everybody who's into punk, you know, at the gig?
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm the same, you know. I can float around Rebellion, for example, and you know, I'll go and check out some of the older bands for nostalgia's sake, because like, you know, I love, you know, some of those old songs mean a lot to me. Yeah, let's just see if they can still play them.
Exactly.
And then go to the new, you know, the new band stage and watch a band I've never heard of before.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, there's room for everything, I think.
I agree. I just hope that the introducing stage at Rebellion becomes bigger and more prominent, because that's the future. You know, that's where the new music is coming from. You know, the other ones have their place. And I, like you, when I've been at Rebellion, I've gone seeing a few songs from one of the big bands, nostalgia's sake, and then saying, yeah, it's not what I want to hear right now. And then I go find something else. But by then the introducing stage is finished for the day, which is good, because if it was still going, nobody would be there because everybody would be seeing the big band. So
Yeah, and I mean, there's obviously new bands coming out that probably wouldn't even dream of playing Rebellion. So, I guess I think that's probably one of the biggest criticisms, not of Rebellion itself, but maybe of the crowd that go there, is that some of them possibly don't support their local gigs. And I know I'm sure a lot of them do. Some people perhaps save all year for Rebellion. And again, I can see the logic in that. You can get 150 bands in a weekend, so you can see 50 that you like, or whatever. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think there's room for Rebellion, there's room for the Manchester Punk Festival, all the other great little punk festivals around the country, and it all just feeds into just the fabric of the scene, really.
Yeah. When the book came out, I'm sorry, I keep picking it up because I absolutely love it. It's the book I wanted to write someday, but never could, because I just don't sit myself down in front of the keyboard and start writing. But with the book, a lot of people thought it was a DIY band book, and it's the DIY scene. And it isn't really. It covers all kinds of punk, just punk in general. Did you get a lot of criticism for that?
I saw someone post about it the other day that they felt the book was revisionist. And I was kind of disconcerted by that comment, because there was never any agenda for me other than to just collect as many decent punk bands from the last 20 years into a book as I could fit in there. And I suppose it's only natural when anyone writes a book that you tend to write it from your perspective. I mean, what other perspective can you write it from? But there was, I suppose, so I was naturally inclined to include some of my favorite bands, some of the bands that I know, some of the bands that I'm in touch with. But yeah, for someone, and then it just struck me, for someone to think it's actually revisionist, that suggests that that I'm trying to write certain bands out of the history of it or something. It couldn't be further from the truth, really. I mean, right up until we finished the book, I was chasing certain bands that I'd been trying to get in the book, and they weren't coming back to me. I was remembering bands. I was like, oh my God, I've left them out. I hope, but when you're that immersed in something with like over 100 bands, you're juggling and everything, it's difficult to do. I'm not making excuses for it. It's and again, I acknowledge it in the intro and say it's not the definitive book. It's just an overview, admittedly biased towards my own perspective as the author. So yeah, that was a bit, for someone to interpret it as revisionist, I was like, oh my God, that was not the case at all. But the DIY thing, I never ever approached it thinking I'm only going to put DIY bands in the book. And I suppose different people interpret that DIY tag, in different ways. But I suppose naturally, because the scene has been pretty underground, a lot of the bands are DIY. But yeah, it was never intended to be just about DIY punk. It was, UK punk in the last 20 years, really. And I mean, I left out, I started thinking, right, I'm going to, I had a list of over 200 bands I was going to put in it. In the end, I had to cross quite a few off. There were bands that were really ska punk and really pop punk, and and I'm like, where do I go with this? They almost all deserve separate books. The new wave of sort of British hardcore, or whatever you want to call it. I'd have loved to have Arms Race and the Flex and bands like that. And then, in fact, I reached out to those bands to try and get them in, but we didn't manage it. But yeah, the trouble is, of course, once it's out, people will think what they think of it, really, you know.
Exactly.
And you can't control it, and that's just, you know, that's just goes with the territory, unfortunately. Putting your name to something that can never be complete. You know, and that you mentioned it being an encyclopedia. You know, if people think it is going to be an encyclopedia, they'll pick it up and they'll think, why isn't this band in there? Why isn't that band in there? You know, so it's kind of it's just a great big fat overview with as many bands in as I could get.
It's a reference.
No apologies.
Yeah, and I was reading some of this. Well, I've been reading a lot of the stories that, and I have to ask, how in the heck did you organize all of this in such a short space of time?
So it took, I think it took just under 2 years, probably.
Yeah.
Which is about the time I take for a book. It was slightly different to some of the other books because I didn't do anywhere near as many face-to-face interviews because of COVID and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, basically, you know, I sort of spend two or 3 hours a day on it, I guess.
Yeah.
You know, spare time, because, you know, it doesn't pay the rent or anything. I work as well.
Yeah.
So every evening I was on it, thousands of emails, you know, and you just kind of have to be disciplined with yourself, really, and set yourself targets. I need to get these 3 sections finished by the end of this week.
Yeah.
You know, to have those 3 queued up for next week.
Yeah.
Because if you're not, the book will never come out.
It'll never be written because
And about 6 months. About 6 months ahead of when it needs to go to print, you know, I start to set deadlines to myself and put myself under a bit of pressure, else it just, you know, it would never get done.
Yeah. What was the most interesting story that you had from a band out of the book?
I mean, there were loads and loads. I mean, I guess probably the one that raised my eyebrows the most was the one about the band that got caught smuggling people into the UK without even realizing it.
Oh God. Who was that? I don't think I've read that story yet.
I'm just trying to think who it was. It was, I'll come back to you in a minute on that one. I have a copy of the book here. Oh, it was Criminal Mind from Bristol.
Okay.
Criminal Mind from Bristol. And I think it's a really bizarre story in that they get invited out to play a gig in the Czech Republic or somewhere like that by a guy that clearly isn't a punk promoter when they get there.
Yeah.
And it was a one-off gig. And then something weird happened in that they insisted they drove them back, you know, and there were all these, and they had a load of extra equipment they were taking back to the UK or something, and there were all these people hiding in these amps.
Oh
and,
my.
and they got pulled at customs and all got arrested, and it was all over the papers at the time and stuff like that.
Yes.
So that was one that stuck out to me, you know.
I was reading for that one.
Yeah.
And I noticed some gaping holes from my perspective, and knowing you wouldn't have just ignored the bands. So
Yeah.
what, down to just they didn't get back to you after repeated contacts, or?
I mean, there were quite a few. I mean, I'm reluctant to name them, but I mean, there were 1 or 2 bands that, you know, actually one of the band's friends sent me an email and said, how come this band isn't in there? And I went back through my emails and messages, and I'd emailed them 8 times, sort of every other month for the last year and a half. And every time I got a message back saying, yeah, we're on it, we want to go in. And they just didn't get their act together.
Yeah.
You know, there were other bands. There was only one band that said, I don't want to go in.
Can I ask who that is, or do you want to keep them anonymous on that.
Yeah, I guess I'll keep it all anonymous. I mean, there's a few bands in every book, you know, that you contact, and some of them say, I just can't be bothered to answer the interview. It's all done and dusted. It's usually bands that have finished.
Yeah.
I guess it just doesn't feel, you know, important, you know, whereas a band that's still going and still actively trying to sell their, you know, latest release or something, they'll jump at the chance. But yeah, I mean, you know, it's frustrating, especially as it's, you know, as one of the bands I really wanted to get in there, you know. But having said that, you know, and what was really frustrating is just after we went to press, one of those bands got back to me and said, "Are we too late for the book?" And I was like, "Yeah."
Oh.
No.
Well,
But there were also bands, you know, that you know, I'm just not familiar with, or I just, you know, I just forgot, you know, I'm not really close to, say, you know, the scene in Leeds. I know they've got a thriving scene in Leeds, and whilst there is one or two bands from Leeds and the Leeds area in the book, you know, you could almost write a whole book on Leeds. Same, but you know, you could almost write a whole book on Birmingham and Sheffield and stuff like that. You know,
Chester, definitely, yeah.
yeah. So it is an overview. It's about, you know, I mean, the other thing with it, with all the books, is I just, you know, in 50 years' time, you know, if someone wonders what was punk like, you know, in the UK and stuff, you know, hopefully the 5 books I've done, if they dug them out of the archives or something, you know, they would be like, it would give them a decent overview, you know.
Yeah, you have a great legacy with that, because you've really helped to document a very important scene throughout the UK. And 2 of them. You've been doing that with the metal as well.
Yeah, I mean, and with the books, I try and include, like, as well as some of the bigger names, also try and include some of the bands that just did one demo, or, you know, maybe even didn't even release anything, you know, on vinyl or CD or anything. Because I think everyone's important.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, we have these little bands that don't release anything, but they still contribute to the scene.
Yeah, that's right. You know, you know, around here, and I keep going back to, you know, when I was a teenager, but that's, you know, that's what you do. But some of the most influential bands on me, you know, there was a band called Corrosive Abuse from Hereford, you know, and I think I saw them twice, and one of my friends sang in the band. And just seeing them and thinking, if they can do it, I can do it. You know, and there was another band from Worcester called Exacerbator, I think they were called. You know, and the Iranian Teaspoons and all these, you know, all these great bands that we would see locally at gigs. And, you know, and, you know, to anyone who wasn't there at those gigs, those names won't mean anything at all, but they were really important to me, and that they, you know, it inspired me to have a go myself, you know. So like you said, no matter how small your band is, if you play a gig or record something and release something and engage with one other person, you worked your way into the story somewhere. But you just can't capture it all in the books.
Definitely not. It would be, you know, like that, because it is quite comprehensive, yet not, you know, because it couldn't be. There is no finite end. There is no finite circle. You know, it's
No.
an ever-moving feast.
I mean, I suppose, you know, one thing I could have done is I could have halved the size of every band section and then got 200 and plus bands in. But I kind of like to give them enough room so you get a really good flavor of the band. They get to tell a few stories, you know, talk about their releases, you know, and hopefully you see, you know, through the bands they interacted with, where they sort of sat in the scene, because it's all like one big, you know, everybody's cogs on different wheels and stuff like that, you know. So yeah, I felt like it would change the format too much from where I wanted it to be, and it would have became like an encyclopedia then, You know, you could just have like one paragraph per band with a photo and some,
No.
you know, discography.
Yeah.
But
Now this
it,
is personal.
yeah,
Yeah, because I reading the stories, especially Casual Nausea, just reading that one, and I'm assuming that was Ed because he was mostly mentioned in it, and just you could almost feel like you were there with them in the early days when they were trying the the problems they had and stuff, and perhaps it's partially knowing them and being able to fit those personalities in. But I've had that with so many of the stories that I'm reading. I can see that. I can feel that. And you wouldn't have that if you had the little tiny paragraph.
no. Well, Casual Nausea were the very last band we got in the book, band number 111. So
I wondered who that last one was. They came in right squeaking in, you know.
yeah, it was seat of the pants kind of time. But you know, a lot of the bands got very similar stories. You know that you know, there's like 51st State, and you know that you know, they come from the back of beyond, you know, the middle of nowhere, and they're booking gigs in church halls and village halls, and you know, even in the middle of the woods, you know, setting up little festivals and creating a little scene, you know. So it's I guess it's a story of scenes within scenes, really. You know that, you know, it all adds together to create this umbrella of UK.
So personally, you play in bands, but are you in one now? Because one
Yeah,
is wrapped up. So,
yeah. So I'm doing a band called Zero Again.
okay.
We've got 2 EPs coming out, one in February and one in March. It's got Glenn from Grand Collapse on drums,
Mhm.
Dean from Regret singing,
Mhm.
shouting, Painey from Bring to Ruin and This System Kills, and about 10,000 other bands on guitar. And yeah, I'm doing bass, and yeah, it's great. Yeah, I mean, we're kind of loosely based in Bristol. That's where we rehearse when we're not locked down.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're sending lyrics and riffs to each other all the time. So soon, you know, like I said, we recorded 15 songs back before Christmas, which are coming out as these 2 EPs.
Mhm.
Probably got another dozen songs
Mm.
to record as soon as we get back at it. So
Wow.
yeah.
Yeah, you guys have been prolific. And lockdown has been good for that for some bands, where they're doing exactly like you guys, swapping the lyrics and the riffs and the beats and coming up
Yeah.
with something. Others have just kind of stepped back and said, we'll worry about it when we can see each other.
Yeah, it's frustrating not being able to play live,
Yeah.
and you know, I think that's made me pick my guitar up every day and play. And you know, I've always been the same. That you know, when I'm jamming, if I come up with something now, I always record it,
Mm.
because otherwise I forget it. You know,
Yeah.
I pick it up the next day and like, where was that riff? And I can't remember. So off the back of that, I've got like a sort of iPad full of about 500-600 riffs, you know, that I keep flicking back through. So we've got plenty of stuff to play with. But yeah, no, it's a good band. It's, you know, it's a good band. It's it's different to Warwind. I mean, I can't see the point in, you know, repeating yourself. And you know, 4 different individuals bring a completely different dynamic.
Yeah.
It's a bit weirder, a bit more rhythmic. It's still heavy, it's still intense,
Mm.
but you know, it's almost darker, really.
Mm.
Yeah, really enjoying it.
I'm looking forward to hearing it then, because I always like
I'll send you some links after we've done the interview.
that would be brilliant. Thank you. And if possible, I could pop them on my radio show that I'm doing.
Yeah, go for it. I mean, you know, there are tracks out there, sort of preview tracks of these 2 EPs. So if you can, yeah, spin a couple of those, that'll be good. Because I think if people like some of the stuff, you know, I've done or any of the other members have done, you know, you can feel it.
Yeah.
you know, in there. So I think you'll get off on it. But you know, people, it's weird what people hear in it, you know, because one minute someone's saying, oh, it sounds like Chaos UK, and I'm thinking, no, it doesn't sound like Chaos UK. But you know,
They-
used to say they're wrong. Other people say it sounds like Killing Joke or Rudimentary Peni or Tragedy or whatever. But you know, it just sounds like it sounds.
Yeah, it is what it is. And it's your creative blending of all of you who are not new to playing in bands. So you're all going to have
Yeah.
a perspective, and you're never going to clone another band.
No.
Not with that
We
perspective.
we certainly don't want to, actually. That's the one thing we've said with this band is, you know, what comes out is what comes out. You know, it's not make a concerted effort, you know, to make it sound like we think it should sound. Let's just let it, you know, give it free rein, really.
Yeah. When do you think gigs are going to happen again?
I think well, I don't want to curse anything that's already booked.
Yeah, but
the way this is dragging on, I can't see it happening until the autumn, really.
Yeah.
You know, I think, I mean, there might be some smaller gigs towards the end of the summer, but you know, I can't see it happening. You know, I mean, you know, the kids aren't even going to be back at school till April.
yeah, exactly.
You know, so how long's a piece of string, I guess, you know.
At the very,
I mean, for rebellion's sake, I hope it's August. You know.
yeah, because I don't think Rebellion will happen this year. I can't see how it will. Manchester Punk Festival already had canceled. And what Glastonbury's canceled, you know, I'm thinking next year personally. Maybe some small things or outdoor gigs, but small outdoor gigs. But I can't see those socially distanced gigs where everybody has to sit at a table. For me, I would go bonkers at that. And I'm not a big dancer or anything, but I like to get up there and feel everybody else's energy and the group energy. It really speaks to me, and you don't have that at a socially.
No.
Everybody's sitting down with table service gig. So.
I mean, when you look at the pictures, well, in the pictures in the book, you know, everybody's on top of everybody else in the crowd, and you know, it's something that we all took for granted. Yeah, and it's been really difficult because I mean, I absolutely love live music. You know, I know I'm not the only one. I think you're right about Rebellion. I mean, if it does go ahead, I think it's going to be a very different looking Rebellion to North, because I can't see all those international bands being able to fly in.
Yeah.
You know, so it's going to be very difficult. I mean, I think, you know, even, you know, I think travel restrictions and quarantine when you travel and stuff like that, I think some of this stuff's going to, basically, we're going to have to learn to live with it. You know?
I agree. Yeah.
You know, and God knows what, you know, be annual vaccines and carrying a vaccine card if you want to fly and not quarantine and stuff, you know. And, you know, because there's no way you know, a punk band can go and do 5 gigs overseas somewhere, come back and then take 2 weeks off work to quarantine. You know, we can barely take the time off to do the tour.
Exactly. And again, Brexit's brought up a big problem with that. And have you had any input or anything with the drive to get the musicians kind of exemption throughout Europe and Europeans coming to the UK?
No, I mean, well, I keep reading things that you think that are kind of frustrating, that, you know, maybe there was potential for a, you know, a non-visa type agreement to have been struck early on in talks and stuff like that. But obviously, so far down the priorities of the people cutting these deals, you know, they don't care about people that far down the ladder. I mean, the main thing I've seen so far, which is crippling people, is the cost of mailing stuff overseas. You know, and there's the first 0 again, 7 inches is on a Polish label, and where we want to import 100 of these 7 inches, you know, it's probably going to cost more than the 7 inches themselves to get them into the country, and double the price of the 7 inches. Mailing the book out, I mean, it's my own fault for making it like 1.5 kilos, I suppose. But you know, it was like 12 quid to places in Europe, but £25 to send it to the States and Japan and stuff like that. It's madness. You know, but I guess international shipping is, you know, it is a commodity we've taken for granted, I suppose, you know, and with all the sort of pressures around climate change and carbon footprints and stuff like that, those sort of luxuries are going to carry a higher price.
Yeah.
From my point of view, when we want to go on tour in Europe, yeah, we'll figure out a way of doing it. You know, we've never had visas when we've toured in America and stuff like that. You just, you know, you go out there and do it, you know, underground, really.
Yeah, just under the radar and hope everything goes well and nobody stows away inside of an amp.
Yeah. The only trouble with doing it that way is you usually have to fly in with no gear.
Yeah.
And you're at the mercy of the gear that you end up playing.
Yeah.
Which isn't so bad for me, because I'm, you know, I've always played any bass. You know, I've had some of the basses I've had myself are so terrible I can play pretty much any bass. But you know, if you're a drummer or a guitarist, and you know, to play that certain part, you know, you really need a certain standard of gear or whatever. That's a bit frustrating, both for the musician and then the people that have come to hear them play it, because they're thinking, this doesn't sound like. You know, like, well, with War Wound, you know, Damien quite often had to borrow a guitar and an amp and effects and everything, and it wouldn't be an ideal setup for him. You know, and we'd be playing Lifeline by Sacrilege, and there's probably people in the crowd that have been waiting, you know, all their lives to hear Damien from Sacrilege play this riff. You know, and it's not quite right because he just hasn't got the gear to play it. You know, so yeah, it's a bit frustrating, but you know, it's one of those things, if you want to go and do it, you have to think outside the box, really.
Not that we are condoning any sort of law breaking, you know, but
absolutely not. No.
It just,
I mean, the other thing for me is I've never ever made a penny touring overseas. In fact, we always lose money. So it's a kind of a kick in the teeth to have to get a work visa when you're not earning any money.
Funny, yeah, it's crazy. So what's next? You're talking maybe doing a second edition of The Scene That Would Not Die, but what do you have in the pipeline now?
Well, I did between 93 and 2018. I wrote for Terrorizer magazine. I did like over 350 interviews, all sorts of bands, you know, Slayer, Megadeth, you know, big bands, Danzig, but loads and loads of really small bands. And then loads of bands that were really small when I interviewed them, but got really big, like Offspring and Bad Religion, and you know, Pennywise and all those sort of bands, plus loads of UK bands, European bands and stuff. And I'm very tempted to collect all those interviews into a book, you know, for posterity's sake, really. But you know, it's also quite interesting, you know, when you see a band, you know, in 97 saying, yeah, we'll never split up, we've written our next 3 albums, and they split up in 98, you know, and stuff like that. So there's a bit of perspective there as well. But so I might do that, but it's gonna have to be 2 books, otherwise it's gonna be twice the size of Scene That Would Not Die.
because the interviews go long and yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, because it was a magazine and most of the interviews were like either 1 page, 2 pages or 3 pages,
Yeah.
you know, probably the longest interview is about 2,500 words. The shortest one's probably about 500 words.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, when I look back at the list of bands and it's, I'm staggered sometimes, I think, oh my God, I really talk to a lot of bands and it's a really eclectic list.
Yeah.
So that'd be quite good fun to put out. And I've got permission from various people at Terrorizer. I'm in touch with some of the old editors who were talking about doing forewords for me and stuff like that.
Oh, that would be brilliant.
So I think it is going to happen. And obviously we'll just keep people posted on that. And then there's this, like I said, there's this other book on just one band that'll get everybody who's into UK punk really excited.
And we can't
that's when I keep it under wraps for them.
I'm interested, but
Yeah, you'll be the first to know.
I appreciate your constraints on that, that you can't say.
Yeah, I don't want to jinx it basically. And I don't like to say, oh, I'm definitely doing this if I'm not, because then you end up with egg on your face or whatever.
Yeah. And people don't trust you then if that happens a couple of times, and
yeah,
no point in doing that. Wait until everything is set. Just making all of us very curious with the dangle of, ooh.
Yeah, that's the PR guy in, I guess.
And on that note, I want to thank you so much for taking the time this lovely Sunday morning to have a chat about your book, life, and
punk
in general. Yeah.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for me being, your first AM interview.
It's a strange morning. And it's the first one I've done on Zoom where my cats have not joined in.
That's disappointing. Yeah, actually, you normally hear my cat yowling somewhere in the background, but he's gone to sleep somewhere. I guess it's the time of day.
I was going to say it must be the time of day where they're just off doing their cat things instead of getting involved with their humans.
No, okay. Well, I want to thank you and Andy as well for all the sort of sterling work you've been doing, documenting the scene as well. It's been brilliant, and the more information there is out there, the better.
Thank you very much. And yeah, that's it. We just want to keep spreading the news about all these great bands because there's some amazing ones here in the UK. I'm so happy to be a part of the scene with it.
Yeah, and I'm sure the scene will bounce back after lockdown if everybody can sort of stay positive. I mean, punk's come back from worse than this, but it's a pretty tough time for a lot of bands, especially the bands that rely on the music, to pay their mortgages or whatever. Some of those bands, and not just the bands, but the crews and the venues and everything.
Exactly.
It's a nightmare, really.
It really is. So hopefully things will get back to normal soon so everybody can get back to normal and keep going with their lives in the scene and the music and all of that.
And there's some really good initiatives as well. I've seen some fundraisers and people selling shirts and zines and stuff like that to support these venues. So if people see anything like that, the money that you didn't spend on going to a gig this month, spend it on that stuff. And, hopefully those venues will be there when we come back at the end of it.
Exactly. Sarah Williams, who does Shout Louder, just released a book, Paper Cuts, which is people's stories about being out on tour, going to gigs, going to festivals. And she's raised over £1,000 for the Music Venue Trust. And that's just with the one book. So if we can get more of that type of stuff going, it would be really nice to see.
Brilliant.
Save the venues and all of that. So
fingers crossed.
Yes, exactly. Well, hopefully I shall see you sometime post-pandemic.
Yeah, we'll do another interview in a car park at midnight.
Wonder who we can get to sing James Brown then.
Oh God, yeah, don't go there. Okay, take care.
Take care and thanks again.
Thanks, Sherry. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.